So today I want to talk about network cables and situations where you might want to make your own. I'll give you some tips and tricks and techniques and talk about a few things that I don't hear being taught much these days anymore. So let's stick around. Alright guys, so network cables. Why would you want to make your own? Isn't Wi-Fi just so available these days? You know, network cabling has a very nice feature that a lot of people don't make use of, but it has something called PoE. It's a function that you can use over network cables in order to power devices, and these days more and more devices are becoming PoE compatible. PoE stands for Power over Ethernet, and what it allows you to do is to push low voltage over the Ethernet cable itself and power the device instead of having to plug it into a wall with a power brick or something like that. But it's very effective, very efficient, and a lot of devices are, having this capability now, and more being developed to utilize it. So network cabling, it looks like, is still going to be relevant for quite a while. Some of these devices might include, your desk phones, the new VoIP phones. They can actually just get their power over the Ethernet cable rather than having to plug it into a power strip or something. And it's very convenient. Other devices might include Wi-Fi access points, security cameras, that kind of thing. So it's very functional. So let's talk about some other reasons why you might want to make your own network cables. Okay, one reason is, instead of just buying pre-crimped cables, is that it's very hard to find something that is over 50 foot in length at your typical stores. Even if you manage to go to one of the large big box stores, trying to find something over 75 or 100 feet is few and far between. So you're back to either having to make your own or you're going to have to special order something. So if you have those large distances to run, you might want to consider making your own cables. Another reason is that when you look at an Ethernet cable, such as this, it has these large connectors on it. So if you're trying to run this through an attic or through a wall or trying to conceal it somehow, it's very difficult to run these large ends through that. You have to drill a hole. If you're going to drill through framing or something, you're going to have to drill a hole 4 times as big to get this connector through than if you just had to run the wire itself. And you'll also notice that these connectors, what's on the end here is called an RJ45 connector. That's the standard that it uses. Now, you'll notice that it has this protective locking tang on it. That prevents the cable from pulling out. And these tangs are very delicate, so you have to be careful with them. If you're yanking this around through walls and things, it's very easy to break those off, so you want to be delicate with those. So that's another reason. If you're trying to run these through concealed spaces, it's a lot easier to run the wire alone than it is trying to run that through it. So let's talk about the tools you'll need. And there's not many. It's actually very, very simple. You will need a stripper to get the sheathing off of the wire, and this is a spring-loaded, just a cheap spring-loaded stripper. The way this works is you have these different size slots in here for different size cables, and it actually has a screw in here to adjust how deep this goes. And it has the blade on there so that when this springs onto the cable, you want to adjust that screw. So you'll have to make a couple of test runs on your cable. Don't just grab it out of the box and go for it. As you change different cables, you might have to adjust that screw too. But the idea is that you want to set it with just enough tension to just score the sheathing on the cable. You don't want to cut into the wire and cut the sheathing off the individual strands of wire itself. Okay, so this is just to strip the sheathing off. It also has a blade in there so that you can trim cut the ends of the wires after you've done it. I never really use that. I usually use my crimper for that. But so there's your stripper. Crimpers. Let's talk about crimpers. This is your standard. It does 2 types of jacks. It does, the bottom here is RJ45, which is one we just looked at on a standard Ethernet cable. The other one's RJ11. So most of these crimpers will do both. RJ11 is your traditional phone line in your house. That's what that is for. So these will crimp both RJ45. You also have your flush cut trimmers down here that you can do. Now, This is one of those situations where I'm going to recommend that you actually stay away from some of the affordable tools that are out there in this. I recommend that when you go with these tools, that you actually start looking at the pass-through connectors, okay? Because that's the last tool you're going to need, is the connector itself to trim out the wire. Now, these connectors, there's two types. There's the traditional type, which most of the cheaper tools, the $15 networking toolkits you get, those tools are the ones that use blind connectors, meaning that you have to trim cut your wires off in order to make sure that they go the proper depth into your connector. Okay. Pass-through connectors mean that you don't have to do that. You can actually feed the wires all the way through the connector, and then the tool itself actually has a blade. It has a little guillotine blade in here that when you crimp the wire, it trims those wires off at the same time. So it's a great time saver. So I tend to stay away from the cheaper network tools that way, because it is a pain to do it the old school way and try and get your depth trimmed right so that all the wires feed up in there just correctly. It's a lot easier to pull your wires through, make sure they're taut, crimp it, and have it trim those things off. So these are great tools. So this is the one that I'm using now. You see the screenshot, the Amazon screenshot. There's also another good one that allows, I think what happened is there was a company that was making these and they owned the patent, and so these tools used to be very expensive to get the pass-through connectors. It was $150 to $200 to get these tools. But ever since, I believe the company's patent ran out, and so there's other manufacturers that make them. So just make sure that you know the difference, that the tools you're buying, whether or not they are for blind connectors or the pass-through connectors, the pass-throughs are the more convenient. There's another brand that I really like, and that's the new Klein Crimpers. What I like about them is that they actually have the color codes imprinted on the tool itself. So if you forget, knowing your pinout codes are very, very important. So that's one thing that's good about the Klein tool. Now let's talk about those pinouts. What do I mean when I'm talking about a pinout? Inside your connector, the pinout is what color wire goes into what placeholder. Okay, that's the pinout. And there are two pinout standards. There is what's called 568A and 568B. Okay, and why are there two standards? Well, back in the old days, they used to have these things called crossover cables. And this is one of those things you don't hear about much anymore, but every now and again, you know, in companies that had a lot of old network cable boxes laying around and stuff, you might pull out a crossover cable and then, you know, notice some weirdness or something. But what a crossover cable was for was connecting light devices. So if you wanted to connect a PC directly to a PC, or if you wanted to connect a switch to another switch, or a router to another router, you would use a crossover cable to do it. Anytime that you didn't have a hub or a switch in the way that did that crossing over for you, you would have to use the crossover cable. That's why there's two standards. And so what the 568A and 568B did is a crossover cable meant that one end on one side was wired to 568A and the other end on the other side was wired to 568B, and that was a crossover cable. In today's world, everything is auto crossover. You buy a switch, it's going to have that auto crossover in it, so you don't find crossover cable. You're going to have to special order one for some older equipment if you end up needing it. So how is that relevant in today's world? Today's world, the majority of the pinouts you're going to see, the majority of cables conform to the 568B standard. Okay, so that's the standard we really want to focus on. And that means that it is wired to 568B on both ends of the cable. And so if you were to compare those ends and hold them up and go left to right, you will see that they are wired the same. So they use the same on both sides. You would definitely see the color codes in there if it was a crossover cable, and they wouldn't match up, so you'd see that. Okay, let's talk about some common mistakes. The most common mistake that people have is ignoring the proper pinouts. People just pick a color code, they just pick them at random, and then they crimp one side on, and then they just make it match on the other side. And you can't do that. If you strip those cables back, and once you unwrap the wire pairs, one thing that you're going to notice is that those wires are all the pairs, they are twisted at a different wrap, at a different wrap tension. So some of them have more twists in them than others, and so that affects your transmission rates. And that's why you can't just pick wires and like put all the striped ones together and then all the solid ones, or pick a color code from light to dark. You can't do that. Because of that, those twists are very important, and that's why the twists and the wires that they correspond with have to go into the right placeholder. So that's your pinout, and that's why it's important to use that 568B standard. Another common mistake that I see is on older connectors, the blind connectors. Okay, again, there's a reason I prefer the pass-through connectors, but on the older blind connectors, when you had to flush trim your wires off prior to getting them into the connector, people would leave a lot of length on there, and then they would have the wire, the sheath cut way back. And it's important to maintain those twists as far in there. You want a nice tight crimp, and you want to maintain those twists as far as you can into the wire. Again, another reason for preferring the pass-through connectors. The other common mistake I see people making is that when they're using their wire stripper, they didn't adjust it to only cut through the sheathing, to only score the sheathing of the wire. And sometimes they cut into the wires themselves, and you want to really avoid that. It'll weaken the wires, and you don't want to risk the sheathing pulling off at any time or stripping back. Now let's talk about the actual operation of it. So I have here a standard CAT5e, I believe, plenum grade wire. I'm going to take my stripper, and again, the goal here is to not cut the sheath. You want to score it so it makes it easier to pull off, because you want to be very careful not to cut into the wires that are inside there. So this has already been pre-measured. I've already got my screw tension adjusted there. So when you go to cut this, leave a generous amount. Okay, it's easier to untwist the wires later if you leave a generous amount, and then you can always cut that off later. But I'm going to give 1.5 to 2 inches or so. Just let the tool hold itself on there, okay? And all I'm going to do is make one twist. That's it. That's all it takes to score the wire. And you'll notice there's this little score in there, and almost like breaking glass, at this point you can just bend that wire and you'll see it separate. Okay, so it almost snaps off. It depends on the sheathing. If it's good wire, it should just snap off, without having to cut all the way through it. So that's it. One twist, and then you're ready to go. Pull the sheathing off. Sometimes in here you'll see this, the ripcord. And what that's there for is several reasons. One is it helps you to, if you need to tear the sheathing back further, you can use that as a tool to help do it. But it's also a stiffener, so when you're pulling this through tight areas, you're not pulling against the wire. It helps to stiffen so that you're not stretching out the wires or anything like that. Now, when you get in and start looking at your colored pairs, take a look at the wires and just observe them, and you will see that there are tighter wraps on some of those. So that's what makes some of them more difficult to unwrap. So I'm going to unwrap these twists. Okay, now that was only like 3 twists on that one, on the orange pair. You can see how much tighter the green pair is. The blue pair is really tight. In fact, I can barely get my fingers in there. Okay, so unwrap that. And your brown pair. So there you go. Now, 568B standard, again, refer to that. I have it memorized. Basically, it's going to be white, orange, orange, white, green, blue, white, blue, green. The way I remember this is I know the blue pair is always in the middle. And ironically, on the B standard, so I know that the blue pair deviates from the standard convention. All the other colors, it's always the striped wire that goes before the solid, but the blue pair gets reversed, and so it's the striped wire that goes after the solid on that one. Your green pair is being split, and then the brown pair. So that's a mess. So what are we going to do about that? The way that I tend to do this is just kind of get your wires roughly. At this point, you don't, if one crosses over the other, it doesn't matter at this point. But we'll just get this in place. And then, you know, just like you were curling paper with scissors to get these straight again, I just tend to use my thumb and finger and just bend them back and forth and rub along them like that to get them straightened out. Okay? Verify the pinout. White, orange, orange, white, green, blue, white, blue, green, white, brown, brown. Okay, I've got my order. Make sure they're nice and straight. The gapping is all even. Verify again. Keep verifying. Now your ends are not going to come out. Once you finish doing this, your ends are not going to be coming out exact. So it helps to use your flush cutters here. Just trim those off to make sure all your ends are flush. Keep watching those wire pairs. They have a nasty tendency to flip on you. It is very monotonous work, but they have a bad tendency to flip around and you won't notice it. Keep watching them. Keep repeating that pattern to yourself. Save your sanity. Okay, I'm going to stick them into my connector, and you have to wiggle them around a little bit. Once they get into the connector, I'm going to verify white, orange, orange, white, green, blue, white, blue, green, white, brown, brown. Okay, got it. And this is why you use pass-through connectors. So you can push the cable up in there, making sure the sheath goes nice and tightly into the connector. And again, why you use the pass-throughs. I'm going to feed the wires into the tool, make sure they're seated nice and well, and I'm just going to crimp down, and there you have it. You can see it trimmed off the connectors for me real well. And that's it. Anyway, guys, I hope you found this helpful and informative. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the button, and we'll talk to you later.